U.S. has got a very bad habit of meddling, and especially in Mexico. And so his sovereignty discourse of we're a free, independent, sovereign nation was very important and powerful also to working class voters because it provides a sense of dignity.
Incumbent parties the world over have lost ground in this year's elections. In fact, the Financial Times have a graph that's really interesting that said this year, for the first time ever, all incumbent parties in the developed world lost vote share. Now, Mexico was not included in this group of developed countries, but also, incumbent parties, even in non-developed countries, or underdeveloped or whatever the Financial Times would say, they also fared poorly. But Mexico bucked this trend, with the governing party Morena gaining vote share and electing its second president, Claudia Sheinbaum, the first woman and the first Jewish person to be elected to that office in Mexico. There might be things that a party interested in building a governing majority on the backs of a working class coalition could learn from this victory. And so we have on the line now Kurt Hackbarth, a writer, playwright, and freelance journalist based in Mexico. He is a co-founder of the independent media site Mex Elects, and he is now here to talk about this win in Mexico and what we can learn in the United States. Kurt, thanks for taking the time to talk to us. Welcome to the Valley Labor Report.
Thanks very much, Jacob. A pleasure to be with you.
Really excited to have you. I have heard some of your interviews on Left Reckoning. Friends of the show over there, David and Matt, they recommended you, so appreciate you taking the time. And so let's just start with the hook, right? Why should I care what happened in Mexico? What is there for me to learn about what Mexico did? Why should we even care about this?
Right. Great question to start. And I think the answer is Mexico shows that the left can win, and it can win big, and it can win in the face of the same international conditions that, have seen other incumbent governments lose. In the face of COVID, in the face of inflation pressures, in the face of supply chain pressures. What we saw in Mexico is a left government, Morena, which has governed since 2018. And just to point out, Morena was just founded as a party in 2014. So it's a very young, new, exciting party that bucked, Mexico's traditional system and old regime. And not only won an overwhelming victory in 2018, but showed that it could win again. And it did that by putting workers' issues first and foremost. I know this is a union-related program. So we're talking about a government that doubled the minimum wage over its 6 years in power. Did a union reform bill that provided for secret ballot elections for unions, and required all union contracts to be renegotiated, and to set up a whole new series of labor boards. It's limited outsourcing for companies so that companies can't outsource their core functions, increased double vacation days, increased profit sharing, increased pension reform, increased pension benefits, came out with a universal adult pension together with disability benefits, aid to dependent mothers, built out a welfare state where one didn't exist in Mexico. And, guess what? Voters liked it and gave them even bigger landslide this time. These things can happen. So to answer your first question, why should we care? It's because left governments are losing everywhere around the world because they've lost contact with their base, they've lost contact with the workers' movement, and Mexico shows that it doesn't have to be that way.
And so let's dig into these to these people and parties. Morena, you said it was founded in 2014. What is Morena?
Morena is a center-left party in Mexico. It's an acronym for Movimiento de Regeneración Nacional, which is the National Regeneration Movement. But it's also a very clever acronym because Morena in Spanish refers to a dark-skinned woman. And so let us not forget, since the time of the conquest and the colony, Mexico is very heavily hierarchized along race and class lines. The wealthy in Mexico are of European descent. Then you have a mestizo population in the middle. and at the bottom historically, and very relegated through terrible historical process, Mexico's indigenous population. So part of what Morena was saying through that very deliberate choice of name is that this is the time for the Morenos, right? This is the time for Mexico's dark-skinned population, right? It's not, a racialized party by any means, but that is there. And it's interesting to see that, whereas in the 2018 election, the working class and poor vote was split amongst parties, there's been an interesting process of, and they've talked about class de-alignment in many countries. There's been a sort of a class realignment in Mexico where working class voters have come home to Morena. And so Scheinbaum in this most recent election a few months ago won an overwhelming victory amongst poor and working class voters, but also won middle class voters and also won upper middle class voters. So it was a cross-class coalition. So I think that's another example of how you can see that a party can pursue policies that benefit the working class without what the Democrats always say in the US, oh, no, we can't talk about these things because we're going to lose suburban voters. Again, saying it doesn't have to be that way.
Right. Yeah, well, and it's crazy because suburban voters are primarily they're higher paid workers, but they're like of the working class. If we conceptualize class in the kind of, what is your relation to the means of production, right? They have a lot of the same interests as the more stereotypical working class electorate, and so that is that's an interesting description of Morena. And so where does AMLO fit into Morena? Is Morena really built around AMLO, or was AMLO kind of grafted onto Morena? Like what were the order of operations there, and what's AMLO's background? The previous president, or I guess current, right? Or I don't think Scheinbaum is inaugurated yet. So maybe current or former president from 2018 until now, AMLO, his background and relationship to Morena.
Yeah, actually, Scheinbaum is in office. She took office on October 1st, and it's interesting because we've talked about Morena as a party, but it's also still important to have a charismatic leader. I mean, there's still that's still fundamental in a movement, and that was really the role that Andrés Manuel López Obrador has played in all of this. López Obrador has been a colossal figure in Mexican politics over the course of a generation. He comes from the state of Tabasco, came from lower middle class, shopkeeper parents, grew up in a small town, very far away from the elite Mexico City governing class that has governed Mexico so badly for so long before him. So just the fact that AMLO was the leader was a challenge to this elite. He speaks with a regional accent, a Tabascan accent, right? Imagine how regional accents are perceived in the United States. The same in Mexico. They're perceived as being hicks, or people who are uncultivated and people who shouldn't govern, right? AMLO had to go through all of this prejudice. And very early on, demonstrated that he had real leadership potential. He started college in 1973. In the second month he was in college, Allende was overthrown in Chile, Salvador Allende. So I think the whole big question of his generation of leaders in Latin America is, how do you achieve power and not get overthrown by a U.S.-sponsored coup? How do you do that? How do you thread that needle? And that was the big argument going forward for his generation. AMLO then became an activist leader in the 80s and 90s with the predecessor party to Morena, which was the PRD. At that time, Mexico was a one-party state under this hegemonic party of the PRI, the famous PRI that governed Mexico for 70 years. And so one of his first major political moves was to engage in a march from Tabasco to Mexico City so that the PRD's first electoral victories would be recognized. They were trying to claim that they didn't win, and not going to go into the weeds in Mexican political history, but AMLO showed that he was a street leader. He was someone who could lead marches, who could lead encampments, who could lead sit-ins, who could defend the indigenous population of Tabasco, who could get beamed by the police and have blood on his face. And these videos are still around on social media. So he came from below in that sense. He was a very successful mayor of Mexico City from 2000 to 2006. In his first run for president, it was stolen from him, the famous or infamous fraud of 2006. He kept at it. In 2012, went at it again, and had a whole array of forces against him that were out buying votes and intimidating votes, and you know, lost again. Not lost in quotes. And then he finally realized we can't do this through the PRD anymore. The PRD is no longer a vehicle for the Mexican parliamentary left. We have to do a new party. Right? Now, Mexican law makes that easier than the US in the sense of there's public financing of campaigns and there's proportional representation seats. So if you have your assemblies and get your signatures, you can get funds, party building funds. And Morena started that way. Started as a party in the 2015 midterms, won a bunch of seats, and that was the trampoline for their victory in 2018. But one cannot understate the effect of López Obrador on Mexican politics. With everything against him, he set up a new party, governed well, and also controlled the discourse, which in a way which I think is really important to learn in the US. He held daily press conferences for 2 hours, up to 3 hours. He took any question that came, anything from anywhere. And that was his way of turning the tables on the corporate press, which is used to setting the terms of the discourse, right? And if you let them run, they'll do a Sanders on someone or they'll do a Corbyn on someone, and they'll bury them. So AMLO's 2-hour press conferences in the morning set the terms of the debate, set the news out, and it allowed his government to weather all of the expected attacks from the national and international press. And he left office a few weeks ago with a 70 to 80% approval rating.
Wow. That's really amazing. And a 2-hour daily press conference. I mean, he had a talk radio show. He just had a talk radio show every morning. That's crazy.
Yeah.
So, you mentioned some of the accomplishments from AMLO's term. I'm interested in what you think some of the most impactful things were, and how they were received by the party, or by the public, I mean. So if you had to point to like the top 3 to 5 things that really have begun to shift the balance of power in Mexico towards working people, what would some of those things be? And is that how, is your estimation of what those 3 policies are, does that match the estimation that the working class themselves in Mexico would have? I'm asking that question to kind of set it up for a conversation about what the Democrats have done during this term, and maybe the kind of disalignment between how the Democrats are viewing what they're doing and how the public is viewing what they're doing. But talk through some of that.
So just a quick point on what you were saying before. It basically was a talk radio show. It was a talk radio show before the nation, right? And that AMLO very early on glimpsed at the potential of social media, right? To break the Mexican media monopoly. Mexico has 2 private networks, Televisa and TV Azteca, like the major media networks in the US. They controlled the debate, very right wing. Radio in Mexico, like right wing radio in the US, was uniformly anti-AMLO, uniformly anti-Morena. So what do you do in the face of that constant daily onslaught? You use social media, you use alternative media. There was AMLO Radio, there was AMLO TV back 15 years ago. And so he was very ahead of the curve on that. And what's interesting as well, that in those daily press conferences, he didn't just have reporters from the major networks. He also had YouTubers in there, people from alternative media. It was a much more open discourse, and that was important. Just a few months ago, I was at an independent journalist conference that was held right there in National Palace, and AMLO hosted it and gave the keynote for independent media, YouTubers, like the Valley Labor Report, just that kind of openness to independent media, and not buying into the elitism of the Beltway credentialed class, or the equivalent in Mexico, is important. Anyway, to go back to your question, I think without a doubt, the universal pension was huge. Mexico was like the U.S. before Social Security, with with a very high percentage of senior citizen poverty, and Mexico traditionally has a very close-knit family structure, but senior citizens having to depend on family members. And now you have this dignity of senior citizens being able to say, I can treat you to dinner, or I can buy my own medication, or I've got my card here, and don't worry about it. I can get this. I can do my own expenses on this. So this dignifying of senior citizens was wonderful to see. I think definitely the minimum wage hikes. Mexico's minimum wage is still far too low, but it went up 20% a year, so it's doubled over the course of his period, and that had knock-on effects to other wages. So wages in general have outstripped inflation by 35% over AMLO's term. And there was actually an interesting labor case, the 3220 movement in Matamoros, in the maquiladoras on the border. They had a labor clause in their contract that minimum wage increases would be reflected in their collective contract. And when the minimum wage started going up rather significantly, they said, all right, that, we get that too. And the bosses didn't want to do that. And that led to the walkout in Matamoros. And they actually won that strike, 2019, 2020. So a minimum wage hike can have other effects. So that's another one. I think another important well, let's just finish with the kind of the pro-workers stuff. I think the pension, I think the minimum wage increase, I think the union bill, because of the long history of the PRI co-opting unions, up to this day, most unions in Mexico are still company unions, and that's still a problem. So the union reform still has a long way to go on that, but that was very symbolically important for workers. And then, yeah, I think that and the vacation days. Mexico's vacation days started at 6, and now you get 12, and depending on the number of years you're in your employer, you can go up to 30. Yeah. If you're not in an outsourced subcontracted job, which is why they also, restricted outsourcing. So all that together comes up with a reasonable package for workers, and can kind of explain alignment. I would say one other important thing for AMLO, but outside of the policy aspect, was standing up for Mexican sovereignty to the U.S. Right? The U.S. has got a very bad habit of meddling and intervening in Latin America, all over the world, but especially in Mexico, because it's so close. And so his sovereignty discourse of we're a free, independent, sovereign nation was very important and powerful also to working class voters, because it provides a sense of dignity. After 30 years of a neoliberal regime, which was totally servile to the U.S. So, for example, when the Summit of the Americas was held in Los Angeles a couple of years ago, AMLO said, hey, I'm not going to go if every country in Latin America isn't invited. Let's not play games here. Is it a summit for everyone, or is it a summit just for your buddies? And he didn't go because they refused to invite, certain countries, right, that the U.S. is trying to keep under their thumb. So all that together is part of the AMLO mystique, let's say.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
Right. And so, some Democrats and people who are supportive of Democrats have frustratedly pointed to some of Biden's, real accomplishments on labor and the economy. And I don't want to deny that. I think you would have to deny reality to say that Biden has had some real accomplishments on improving the rights of working people and on spurring a new, manufacturing, manufacturing economy in the United States. But they're clearly not analogous. The working class in the United States are clearly not feeling this in the same way, clearly not being affected by these policies in the same way that they have been in Mexico. And so why do you think they're not analogous, what Biden has been able to do and what AMLO was able to do?
I think that's a really, really good question. And I think the initial answer is Biden's programs were temporary in large part. They were COVID spurred. So you had the increase in enhanced unemployment benefits, you had the child tax credit, you had the extended Medicaid benefits. All of those were great, but then they yanked them away. They yanked them away. So what people are left with is I had something and I lost it. So they wind up blaming the person who took them away without maybe even thinking about, well, maybe he gave it, we got them from that administration in the first place. They were a COVID expedient, but it seems like as soon as they could get away with getting rid of them, they pulled the plug. And so then you had the situation where just weeks before the election in the US, people were losing their Medicaid, enhanced Medicaid benefits. They'd already lost the child tax credit, and they had to start paying their student loan payments again. I mean, not brilliant politics. Whereas in Mexico, you have the situation where these programs were made permanent. They weren't just COVID expedients. And actually, the Sheinbaum government now, because Mexico, Morena won a 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress, are bringing them up to the constitutional level. They're putting them into the Constitution so that no future conservative government can take them away. They're enshrining them as rights, not just programs, but rights. So I think that discourse is important, right? You have a right to, education and, scholarships, and stay in school scholarships. You have a right to healthcare. You have a right to housing. The Sheinbaum government now is setting up a program to build a million units of public housing, where workers can rent these units at a social rent that is no more than 30% of their salary. And it's a rent to buy, where after 10 years of renting, what you've paid in rent can then go towards the price of the house. Because it's not throwing them to the wolves of the market, but it's going to be housing built by the Public Housing Authority. So you can set up something like this. Wow, well, that's a big difference. Because Mexico, like the US, has a real housing problem and has rising rents, and it has very expensive housing costs in a number of places. So I think that's it too. The idea that they're rights, they're not temporary programs, and that we're not going to be beholden to the market. Remember, I think Kamala's housing program was all going through private builders. So when you go through private builders, you can't set up, a rent to buy program with social rents and lower discounted rents for first time renters and students who are, just coming out of school. All the things you can do if you harness the power of the public sector.
Right. And that's interesting. And I think that I agree with that. I do think that there, we have to acknowledge some of the things that Biden accomplished, but it was not, even to the extent that there were things accomplished, they were not transformative in the way that it seems the Morena's program has been for working class people in Mexico. And so, do you think that that what has been happening kind of since 2018 in Mexico, do you think that this is equivalent to like the New Deal era in the United States? Is there a similar realignment and, restructuring of power in favor of working people, similar to what we experienced during the New Deal under FDR?
Yeah, I think that's a good comparison. And to be fair, too, I mean, Mexico was starting from a very low bar in some of these areas, and the minimum wage was just absurdly low, absurdly low. So it went up 100%, but it's still too low. But it was still something that people felt compared to what it was. and then the knock-on effects that it had on other wages. And so even according to it was the World Bank, I think it was 9 million people were lifted out of poverty in this administration, and that was in the face of COVID. So that's no small thing. When you see your wages are going up, people are coming out of poverty. You see infrastructure projects that are happening, like the new airport in Mexico City. Mexico is rebuilding its train network. You see things like that. You say, oh, okay, all right, they're not throwing away, my tax money. They're using it for productive purposes. I think the New Deal analogy is yeah. I think it's a very similar situation. The New Deal arose out of the Great Depression, of course, in the US, and Mexico wasn't going through a Great Depression as such, but it was going through, a chronic period of low growth, neoliberal policies, a real rotten, corrupt, kleptocratic elite that thought that they owned the place. Part of the whole AMLO phenomenon that got them so angry was not just that he was, instituting progressive policies, but that he wasn't one of us, in quotes, wasn't one of them. He came from another social class. He came from another state. He came from another region. He talks in a very colorful way with very colorful phrases, folksy, not the polished technocratic discourse of decades before, of people who mostly had been, educated in elite US universities and came back to apply that elite US university model to Mexico with very poor results. So it was a breaking with a lot of things there. And I think, the New Deal analogy, yes, right? You have, in FDR's case, it was, it wasn't creating a new party like Morena, but it was really doing something very different with the Democratic Party than the way the party had existed before him. In the case of Mexico, it realized at this juncture, a new party was necessary. But I think you're seeing a building out of a welfare state with, very interesting parallels to the New Deal in the US. Yes.
And so, the continuation of these popular periods in society is always a very difficult thing. We saw, the New Deal was relatively, stable, and we do still have a lot of pieces of the New Deal left. But ultimately, there was, we went through kind of a period of reaction in the 80s with Reagan. But in Latin and South America, it seems like there's an even deeper problem with maintaining and continuing these legacies. After when Lula left office in Brazil, there was kind of a collapse of his party and his movement. With Evo Morales in Bolivia, we've seen a similar dynamic. The MAS is really in disarray at this time, and it's unclear what the future is going to be like in Bolivia, even after these really stunning periods of economic expansion and shifting power towards working people. And this is another case where it seems like Mexico is bucking the trend, right? Not only did Sheinbaum succeed AMLO, Dilma Rousseff succeeded Lula, but it was with a significantly lower vote share, and then ultimately, she was ousted. Sheinbaum won with a higher vote share than AMLO did. So it seems like not only are we not looking at a period of successful reaction or counter-revolution yet, but we're seeing the successes grow and build on itself. And so why do you think that is? And what was Scheinbaum's program during the election? Was it running explicitly on just a continuation of AMLO, or were there additional things that she said that we are going to go further and be, potentially even more radical in my administration?
Sure. It's interesting that Lopez Obrador kind of, with a gleam in his eye in his final days, he said, you think I was left. He said, just watch out. I'm kind of bougie compared to Scheinbaum. Watch out. She's tough. She's tough. And she's proven to be that in her first month in office. She's got a real no-nonsense demeanor. She's continued with the morning press conferences, and you know, people try to trip her up, and she's just been very good at shutting them down. People have been trying to create all kinds of hysteria about the Trump election, and that, oh, Trump is going to treat Scheinbaum so badly, and Trump is going to come after Mexico and whatever else. She's been like, take it easy. Take it easy. We'll deal with this. We'll deal with this when it comes. So, with regards to Scheinbaum, she very specifically ran on continuing AMLO's legacy. She didn't run away from AMLO like people, the kind of the high-priced consultant class would try to have her do, as if she were, a detergent or a box of cereal. You have to, you have to have your own brand. She's like, no, this is a movement. This is a party movement. This is a movement party. Very proud of Lopez Obrador, and we're going to continue a lot of the programs that I mentioned here. But there's going to be a new element she calls the second floor of the transformation, right? The first floor and now the second floor. And that one of them I mentioned was the 1 million units of public housing. Another one is lowering the pension age for women, this new universal pension from 65 down to 60, because women in Mexico and all over the world, a lot of times, are the primary caregivers for children and for aged relatives, and for a whole variety of reasons, a lot of times don't have the opportunity to build up their own retirement savings. So she said the retirement age for women should go down to 60. There's a whole new accent on women's issues. Mexico actually just passed its own version of the Equal Rights Amendment on Friday, the ERA, enshrining gender equality into the Constitution. That's a big one. She also wants to boost investment into science and technology, wants Mexico to design its own electric car, put a satellite into space. Traditionally, Latin America was simply seen as an exporter of raw materials to the global north. And the effort of Scheinbaum and governments like this is to say, we have our own materials and they're ours, and we should be able to have a whole production capacity with them, right? And not just be an exporter of low-wage labor or maquiladora workers, which are, just assembly workers, but, really use, for example, Mexico's got lithium, which it nationalized a few years ago. Use that lithium for its own, productive chain and its own productive capacity. So that's a lot of what Scheinbaum wants to do there with regards to the pension, with regards to housing, with regards to making those stay-in-school scholarships universal. That anyone in public school who stays in school will get a scholarship for, books, materials, uniforms, supplies, so you can have breakfast, all these things that will try to help keep kids in school. So there's some exciting stuff coming down the pike. And I think your point is really well taken, though. Morena just won a smashing victory, but that's no time for it to rest on its laurels, because there are always forces that would try to stymie this, right? And we saw this, as you mentioned, in Brazil. We see the problem now in Bolivia, right? Ecuador, these well-funded campaigns of lawfare, which is the attempt to use the judicial branch to, stop popular movements, stop people's movements in their tracks, right? We need to look no farther than the U.S. and know how a conservative court can, really throw a wrench into the works. And actually, one of AMLO's last measures was a judicial reform, providing for the direct election of judges. Mexico has a very corrupt and a very conservative judicial system, and they're now going to be, including the Supreme Court, going to be elected by popular vote. And the hue and cry about this, and it's against democracy and it's against the separation of powers. And, it's like, a lot of states in the U.S. elect judges.
Right. Yes, like Alabama, one of the most conservative states in the country. Our state Supreme Court is popularly elected. So as we're rounding out, just for my own edification, I'm curious what your read is on the role that unions play in Mexico society, in Mexico generally, and the Morena coalition specifically, because I've been aware of, like you mentioned earlier, the Mexican labor movement is primarily a movement of company unions. And for people that don't know what a company union is, that just means that a union that is dominated by the company. It's, it is what it sounds like. And so not a real independent labor union. That is the Mexican labor movement is just really plagued by this. And so how are these company unions responding to Morena, and to what extent there is a burgeoning independent labor movement in Mexico, and to what are Morena, specifically trying to make paths for these independent unions to kind of take over these company unions or beat back the company unions? Or are they or is Morena being more kind of neutral in the fight between these two ostensibly union forces? Unpack that for us.
Good question. It's so important we're talking about this. Like you said, as I mentioned earlier, the sad history of unionism in Mexico has to do with its co-opting by the one-party state of the PRI for 70 years. So unions were totally co-opted into that umbrella, which is sad and ironic, because actually the Mexican Revolution, the famous Mexican Revolution of 1910, was sparked by labor struggle, by the famous miners' strike in Cananea, Sonora, right, back in 1906, which sparked the first major revolution of the 20th century. And then you had the expropriation of Mexico's oil industry in 1938, also based on labor issues, because multinational oil companies refused to settle with striking workers, despite an arbitration board ruling. And so that gave then President Cardenas the pretext to expropriate the industry. So labor issues have been so important in Mexico history throughout the 20th century. It was really tragic that it went through the period of co-opting, and it's just now emerging from that. You still see a situation where 80, maybe even up to more percent of unions in Mexico are company unions. They're company unions. They're in the pockets of employers. Now, AMLO's union reform made some very important steps to that. It provided for secret ballot elections, because a lot of times before you just have the raising of hands on the shop floor. So of course you could point out people, or just kind of very pro forma elections that, the results were, very obvious from beforehand who was going to win. And so the union reform set up secret ballot elections, and also required that all contracts be negotiated within 4 or 5 years. And that a lot of those contracts are up now, because the union reform is about 4 or 5 years old. So the union reform is also going to set up a whole new system of labor boards, basically labor courts. And that's been slow to happen. And so you've gotten to the situation where some of these contracts have come up, but they haven't been replaced by something else. And the courts have been slow to get started. And it's been a slower process than a lot of people would have liked. Despite that, there have been some notable independent union victories. I mentioned one, which is the 3220 movement in Matamoros. There have also been some important victories in auto plants, the Cintia victory in Guanajuato in 2022, the independent victory of SNITIS, the Cintis independent union in Matamoros in Reynosa. That was like the trifectory of big wins a couple of years ago. So you've seen some important wins. Just the problem for independent unionism is they've got so much against them. They've got like in the US, they've got so much against them with regards to money, against them with regards to, the press, with regards to just they create all kinds of difficulties for unions to organize, direct intimidation, direct physical intimidation at times. So this is a place where a lot of work needs to happen, and Morena hasn't done enough. That would be my critique of this in this case. Morena really hasn't done enough. It's been neutral on it. The union bill was good, but what you don't see is kind of rank and file members of Morena getting, really going, heart and soul into the union organizing process. It's been kind of hands off. Now, one can understand that in the sense of they don't want to repeat the co-opting of unions that happened in the days of the PRI, which is very recent history in Mexico, and people are very well aware of that they don't want parties co-opting unions. But that said, it's such an uphill struggle for independent unions to win, even in the new conditions, that, where's the party here? So I think that's something they still have to work out. Morena, it's not like the UK Labour Party by any means, where unions have their vote and dues. It's nowhere near that kind of relationship where the dues go to the party and they have their block vote in the convention and all that. Nothing like that. Nothing like that. Nothing like that at all. Now, I'm not saying they have to adopt a model that's that close, but I would like to see Morena take more interest in union matters than they've shown so far.
Right. Well, maybe they will. They've got 6 years under Scheinbaum, so we'll see how it goes, and we'll try to have you back on during this time to let us know how things are going. I really appreciate your time, Kurt Hackbarth, freelance journalist in Mexico. Thanks for your time. Where can folks find your work?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one other thing that I was just thinking about with regards to the whole union issue. Just make a call for the best of the U.S. union tradition, which is international solidarity. I think sometimes we can all slip into this discourse of, oh, they're taking our jobs in Mexico, as if Mexican workers wanted to take the jobs of U.S. workers. It's actually workers on both sides of these policies. Mexican workers aren't trying to take away your jobs in the U.S. They're suffering as well, and under even worse conditions in cases. So how can there be solidarity between unions to help people on both sides, against what can often be very, very abusive employers, international employers. So so I'm in Jacobin magazine. I write monthly on Mexico in Jacobin. You can find my work there. A couple of articles that I'll highlight. One of them is a recent one that was called Mexico's Lessons for the International Left. And I go into more detail of some of what we talked about here. And also, if you're interested more in the union aspect, I came out with a piece a couple of years ago. It's called "In Mexico, Workers Are Struggling for Independent Unionism." And that goes into more detail about some of what I couldn't mention here. So I recommend those two pieces. And we also have a podcast in English. It's called Soberanía, which is the Mexican word for sovereignty, Soberanía, the Mexican Politics Podcast. And we're on YouTube. We're on Spotify and Apple Podcast. And we're regular guests over there at Left Reckoning, so you'll see us back over there, I'm sure, fairly soon. But check us out at the podcast. We come on weekly with a great Mexican journalist colleague, Jose Luis Granado Ceja. The podcast is called Soberanía, Soberania. Check us out. Give us a like. Give us a subscription. That always gives us a boost. And it helps, get some of the stuff out in English, because a lot of the English language, media about Mexico is just terrible. It's really bad, really, really bad. So anything you can do to help get out, the other story of why you have a party that can win elections and also be helping people at the same time, I think it'd be great to get that message out there.
Yep. And I do want to hold up, you mentioned the importance of international solidarity, particularly from the United States, which is, the author of so much suffering, particularly as you mentioned in Latin and South America. The UAW has been doing a really good job. I think well, actually, let me ask you that question. I think the UAW has been doing a good job under Sean Fain with international solidarity. They were a big reason that some of the independent Mexican unionists came to labor notes and gave one of the, closing plenary speeches, I think. It was either closing or opening, and this independent Mexican unionist got standing ovation from American unionists, and it was really exciting to hear that. But what is your assessment, if you have time? I know that we're running a little long, but what is your assessment, if you have time, of the UAW's kind of new stance towards Mexican unions?
Yeah, I think it's been good. And I remember what you said about when the Mexican Union is there, and the whole thing with labor notes. But I think there's more to do because I think there's sometimes kind of a reflexive reaction to just say, oh, it's uh, just U.S. workers here or just U.S. Canada or whatever else, and you see efforts to try to play one country off each other. You just dug forward there, and Canada was trying to say, "Oh, we're going to cut Mexico out of the free trade agreement because it's up for revision in 2026." They always try to find these um, ways to undercut international solidarity. So I just say, yeah, more of it, please. And um, I think one of the interesting things is that rapid response mechanism. I'm not a great fan of the free trade agreement at all, but that rapid response mechanism has helped set off some of these independent um, cases that we mentioned, like Cinti and Cintas and Guanajuato and Matamoros and Reynosa. So that's something they may very well try to get rid of down the line when they try to revise it. So let's try to just keep it going. I'd say.
Absolutely. All right. Kurt Hackparth, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.